Hello, everyone. Welcome back to class. This is week number 6, and we are starting with chapter 3. So, this chapter is titled Designing Significant Learning Experiences 1 Getting Started. And as we reviewed the first couple chapters of the book, Fink presented a couple key ideas. All teaching should strive to create significant learning experiences, and it is useful to use the taxonomy. That taxonomy, whether it's Bloom's or Fink's, is a language and a set of concepts for identifying what constitutes such experiences. If you accept the associated premise that higher education is and ought to be moving toward a learning-centered approach, then this question arises. How can teachers do a better job of creating significant learning experiences for our students? So we've got to put a course together. And again, we're thinking about doing things to create significant learning. There are 3 basic ways of putting a course together. When you are faced with putting together a course, you're going to use the list of topics approach, or the list of activities approach, or the integrated course design. For the list of topics approach, the teacher looks at the subject, identifies the 8 to 12 major topics on it, and then proceeds to work up lectures on each topic. With the addition of a midterm exam or 2 plus a final, the course is ready to go. The list of topics may come from the teacher's own understanding of the subject or from the table of contents of a good textbook. So this is a very common way of doing things, and again, probably a way that is used more often for undergraduate degree programs or for undergraduate courses. This approach, quick to do, easy to do. You create a week-to-week outline of topics, rarely takes more than 30 to 45 minutes. That's what we're going to be doing this week for your homework assignment. That's described further in the short 2-minute screencast. The downside is it focuses on the organization and delivery of information, usually through many lectures, and pays little or no attention to the quality and quantity of student learning. As a result, this design process tends to support only the learning of foundational knowledge. The second approach is the list of activities approach. It creates a structure for the course organized around the major topics, but it avoids the overemphasis on lecturing by using more active learning. The teacher puts a case study, for example, in week 2, a simulation in week 4, a role play in week 6, and so forth. This succeeds in making the course more interesting and engaging. But it still has no focus on learning and also lacks integration. On what basis does the teacher put the case study in week 2 rather than someplace else? The third approach, the alternate to these 2 approaches, is the learning-centered approach. And this is called the integrated course design. In this approach, the teacher takes responsibility for deciding what would constitute high-quality learning in a given situation, and then for designing what quality into the course and into the learning experience. So, this is the new and recommended model by Fink. There are attractive features to this model. It's simple, it is relatively easy for teachers to remember the basic model. It's holistic in that it unpacks and reveals the complexity that exists in effective course design. It's practical, it identifies what one needs to do in the course design process. It's integrative, it shows the interactive relationships among the key components of the course, and it's normative. It provides specific criteria for determining whether a given course design is good or not. The basic features of integrated course design are shown in this figure here. The box at the bottom, situational factors, refers to information that needs to be gathered. The three circles above refer to decisions that need to be made. The arrows coming up from the box indicate that this information should be used in the process of making the three key set of decisions. The arrows connecting the three circles indicate that the components need to be connected to support each other. The basic outline leads to a series of key questions that need to be answered when designing any learning experience. What are the important situational factors in a particular course and learning situation? What should our full set of learning goals be? What kinds of feedback and assessment should we provide? What kinds of teaching and learning activities will suffice in terms of achieving the full set of learning goals we set? Are all the components connected and integrated? That is, are they consistent with and supportive of each other? So you may note that in the sequence of questions, the one on feedback and assessment comes before the one on teaching and learning. For many people, this is counterintuitive. However, after many years of working with different professors on designing and redesigning courses, Fink notes that if we deal with assessment first, it greatly enhances our ability to identify what learning activities are needed. So going back to the musculoskeletal examination course, if we know that we're going to have a lab practical and there are components that we want the student to be able to perform and demonstrate, then we can work backwards. This is backward design. As implied by the label, the designer starts the process by imagining a time when the course is over, and then asking, what is it I hope that students will have learned that will still be there and have value several years after that course is over? One very important feature of this model of course design is the proposition that the three initial decisions need to be integrated. The learning goals, the feedback and assessment, and the teaching and learning activities must all reflect and support each other. To illustrate how critically important this is, Fink describes a hypothetical course that lacks integration. Imagine yourself talking to a professor who is teaching a poorly designed and ineffective course, one that violates all the known principles of good teaching. He has come to you asking for help in analyzing his course and figuring out what needs to be changed. First, you ask the professor what he wants students to get out of the course. His response is, quote, I want to cover all the important content in world regional geography. After pointing out that covering the content is what the teacher does, not what the students do, you repeat your request for a statement about learning goals. So he converts his statement to a learning goal. I want the students to master all the important information and ideas about the different world regions. So you note that one of his learning goals is for students to fully understand and remember important content. But you press a bit more with the question, is there not anything else you would like students to learn in this course? After some reflection, he replies, quote, well, it would probably be nice if they could also learn how to think critically about world geography. There. He now has a learning goal that's a bit more significant, critical thinking. You could press for more significant learning goals, but you have two you can work with, foundational knowledge and a critical thinking version of application learning. So now that you have interviewed that faculty member, or maybe put yourself in the position of that faculty member, when you have goals in mind, you can work backwards. You can figure out, okay, what does it take to get to that point? Or I like the idea of thinking of the assessment Here's what I need them to be able to do to demonstrate they can be a PT or an OT or an RN or a PA. To be able to demonstrate that, here's what they need to be able to do. Here's what I need to be able to teach them. Here are the steps to that process. So this is illustrating a course integration problem. When you turn to the question of the teaching and learning activities used in a course and find that the course is a straight lecture course, like 15 weeks of lectures, interrupted only long enough for exams, each week the teacher lectures on a new region, and the students read the relevant chapter in the textbook. This is a problem. There's a disconnect or a lack of integration between the learning goals and the teaching and learning activities. Assuming for a moment that the teacher, going back to that example before, the geography teacher or the world regions teacher, is effective as a lecturer, that he has a good textbook, and that the students are good note takers and readers, there is a moderate possibility that they will succeed in learning the content. But they're getting no practice and feedback that will support learning how to think critically about the subject. In terms of basic design of the course, this means the course has a disconnect as shown on figure 3.2. There's a disconnect between learning goals and the teaching and learning activities. Now, a problem can occur when the time comes to create the midterm or the final exam. What kind of questions should that individual write? He can write content-related questions, and with a little luck, the students may do acceptably well on these questions. But again, sometimes I hear this from undergrad students. They're like, I have no idea what to study because the questions don't reflect the material presented in class. So, what about critical thinking? What if the teacher wants critical thinking to be there, but hasn't given a chance for critical thinking to be included in the work in class? Well, the students haven't had a chance to develop that. And they'll probably do poorly. And so that's reflected here with this. There's a disconnect between the teaching and learning activities and the feedback and assessment. Now, the professor could not include thinking questions, critical thinking questions, because they wouldn't be fair. The assessment would, in this case, properly reflect the teaching and learning activities, but not support the learning goals. And that's reflected in 3.4. Ultimately, what we want is we want balance. We want the learning goals to be connected to feedback and assessment. We want the learning goals to inform teaching and learning activities. And also there's a connection between teaching and learning activities and feedback and assessment. They're all interconnected there. If they're not, then the teacher is not going to have success meeting those goals that he has to start the course, at the start of the course. So designing a course includes 3 phases, each of which involves a number of substeps, as shown in Exhibit 3.1. So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at this process. So there is the initial phase, build strong primary components. The intermediate phase, assemble the components into a coherent whole. And the final phase, finish important remaining tasks. So let's look at the initial phase here first. The initial phase of the design process calls for the teacher to build strong primary components, the learning goals, feedback and assessment measures, and teaching and learning activities. These components must be built properly because they form the basis for the rest of the design process. And the initial phase begins by examining various situational factors and determining which of them may be significant in a particular course. So, identifying important situational factors. Step number 1. When designing a new course or redesigning an old one, the first step needs to be a careful review of situational factors that may affect the 3 key decisions. If you skip over this step or do a superficial job, you increase the chances of ending up with a course that doesn't work for the students involved, doesn't meet the needs of the curriculum, doesn't fit the teacher, or otherwise misses the mark. It is important to take the necessary time to carefully review a number of potentially important factors and determine which of them need to be kept in mind during the rest of the design process. Drawing from the literature on instructional design and from Fink's own experience, Fink put together the checklist of potential significant factors, Exhibit 3.2. So, I'm going to pause the recording. I want you to read through this, review the specific content of the teaching and learning situation, look at those questions, think about your typical class. What are the expectations of external groups? Review that, think about that class and how that meets that. What's the nature of the subject? And what are the characteristics of the learner? Go ahead now, pause the recording. Okay, I assume now that you have read through that, let's go ahead and move on. There is another component to this. To finish off 3.2, there is the characteristics of the teacher and special pedagogical challenge. Please read through these now. Go ahead and pause the recording. Okay, I assume you've had a chance to review through those. Now, the assumption is that for any given course, some of these factors will be important and others will not be. But if you systematically go through the whole list, you should be able to identify all the major factors for any particular course. Next, specific context. Let's go a little bit deeper into each of these. You've read through them. How many students? Typically in our graduate school classes, we're going to have a set number that has been established by the program or by administration. Is a class an introductory type course or a graduate seminar? Again, we're in graduate school, so we're going to be something like a first year course, second year course, or a third year course. When does the class meet? That's usually established. And it's established so that way a student has kind of class on a Tuesday, maybe on a Thursday, or Tuesday and a Friday, so they have days in between to be able to prepare for the next class as needed. And then, is the class live or online? So is it delivered synchronously or asynchronously? Expectations of external groups. Groups external to the course frequently have expectations about what students should learn, and the teacher needs to take these expectations into account. For example, society wants graduates of college courses in the United States, government, and U.S. history realm to have basic knowledge of the aspect of our country and perhaps a commitment to the ideals and activities of civic-minded citizens in a democracy. Sometimes the college or university wants particular courses to contribute to the institution's writing across the curriculum agenda. Sometimes departments have courses designated to attract majors, or at other times to separate the wheat from the chaff. Nature of the subject. There are significant differences in the nature of different subjects taught in higher education, and these differences need to be reflected in the course design. Some courses deal with subject matter that's primarily theoretical. The general purpose here is for students to understand the differences between various theories and the implications of these differences. Other courses deal with subject matter that's very practical in nature, meaning the direct goal is for students to learn how to do something. Again, A lot of that at the undergrad level. At the graduate level, we have classes that typically build upon each other. So a student might take therapeutic exercise in the first year of a physical therapy program. They will have had their anatomy classes and their biomechanics. So that way, when they go into the second year of the program, they are able to take their musculoskeletal examination. They have that background information, which then allows them to now, with new education, new material taught, do an examination, think about the structures involved, think about how the body has been affected biomechanically, and then apply treatments to address that. Characteristics of the learners. Every educational situation has a set of students involved, and these students differ from course to course and even from student to student within a given course. Now, for us, we have all physical therapy students or all occupational therapy students, people that have chosen to apply to a particular program and have been accepted because they have met some minimum criteria. However, there are different learner characteristics even within that group. And sometimes people will have a learning disability manifest that wasn't apparent at the undergraduate level. Characteristics of the teacher. It's easy to forget that the teacher is an important component. It is important for you to review your characteristics when designing a course. What is it you want to do? What is meaningful to you? How are you able to impart the information in a way that promotes active learning? The special pedagogical challenge. After a teacher has reviewed each of these situational factors and decided which are relevant to a given course, Fink finds it useful to pose a concluding question in a way of integrating and focusing the information. What is the special pedagogical challenge of this course? That is, what is the special situation in this course that challenges both students and teacher to make this a meaningful and important learning experience? If the teacher can find a way to successfully meet that challenge, the chances of the course being a success for the students are high. All right, so summarizing that first step. Again, that first step is to identify important situational factors. The key point to remember about this first step in course design is that it's important to do a careful, in-depth job of collecting and analyzing information about various situational factors. Skipping this step or doing a cursory job will result in a bad decision later on. However, a thorough, in-depth analysis here positions one to see important needs and contextual factors and will often even suggest answers to the design questions that need to be considered next. Okay, let's go to number 2, identify important learning goals. You want your students to learn. You want students to learn about and master a topic, whether that be basic care skills, diagnosis, prescriptive therapeutic exercise, whatever the case may be. You're making a list of topics in this case, but instead of making a list of topics, use a learning-centered approach and identify what students should get out of the course. This is where Fink's taxonomy of significant learning can be of value. And that's what we see here. Look at the foundational knowledge, application, integration, human dimension, caring, and learning how to learn. If you can use this taxonomy to describe what you want students to learn in your course, then you will be able to select the kinds of teaching and learning activities and the feedback and assessment activities needed to support this kind of learning. So, formulating significant learning goals. The basic procedure for formulating learning goals is to ask a series of questions about each kind of learning that is potentially relevant. Using the taxonomy of significant learning, this would involve asking what each kind of learning would mean in the context of a specific course. Exhibit 3.3 contains a list of questions focused on the 6 kinds of learning in this taxonomy. The suggestion is that you answer each question, or at least the most important question within each set for the course you're working on. So, what impact do I, as the faculty member, want this course experience to have on students that will still be there a year or more after the course is over? So go ahead and pause the recording and read through some of these questions for foundational knowledge. And moving forward, let's do the same thing. Keeping that in mind, pause the recording and read these questions. Okay, picking things back up again. I assume you've read through those questions. Let's continue on and now reading for caring and learning how to learn. Go ahead and read through those there. Now, figure 3.4 illustrates what some answers might look like. So if you were teaching a microbiology class at the foundational level, after a year, you might want the students to remember the terms associated with microbial anatomy, biochemistry, and disease. For psychology at the application level, you might want them to be able to engage in quantitative reasoning, that is, construct a distribution of quantitative information, so creative thinking. Here are some additional examples. Go ahead and pause the recording and read through some of them. Okay, picking back up again, here's some additional ones for human dimension and caring. Go ahead and pause the recording and read through some of those. And finally, for learning how to learn, go ahead and pause the recording and read through some of those. All right, so the other important feature of the learning goals shown in the prior exhibit, Exhibit 3.4, is the verb that begins each statement. Know how, be able, continue, understand. It is important to formulate goals that start with verbs to indicate what it is you actually want students to do in the future. But it's also important for these verbs to be concrete and as specific as possible. Pushing yourself to find and use such verbs will clarify for you and for your students what it is you really want in terms of student learning. To help with this process, review Exhibit 3.5. This is a list of verbs that would be appropriate for significant learning different domains. And you'll notice that some of these are similar to what we would see with Bloom's taxonomy, but these are specific ones to Fink's taxonomy. If you need to, pause the recording and go back and look at those. All right, some tips for foundational knowledge. The key here is to limit yourself to identifying only what is really important for students to have in long-term memory 1 to 3 years later. For application, this is where thinking skills and other skills come in. Ask yourself, what is it I want students to be able to do in relation to this subject 1 to 3 years after the course is over? For integration, the main point with integration is to think about what kind of connections you want students to make. Do you want them to connect the course material to everyday life or to other realms of study or to other closely related subjects of study? Human dimension, this kind of learning has 2 closely related components, learning about oneself and others. For the first component, ask yourself whether you would like the students to see themselves in some new way. For the second component, ask whether you want the students to gain a new understanding of how to interact with other people in relation to the subject. For caring, most professors want their students to gain an increased appreciation for the subject being studied, to value it more highly than before. For learning how to learn, this kind of learning is more complex because it has three distinct forms: becoming a better student, learning how to inquire about this particular subject matter, and becoming a self-directing learner. If one is selective and focused, it's possible to imagine a course addressing all three in one way or another, as the statements by the microbiology professor earlier on imply. Tips for selecting learning goals include as many kinds of significant learning as possible, and link your learning goals to your own dreams. As an additional resource, when the Air Force Academy decided to become a learning-centered institution, they realized this meant the courses there needed to have well-written learning goals. So the staff at the Center for Educational Excellence put together a primer on writing effective learning course goals. This document contains 7 principles for this task. One of the most useful parts of the document are the examples of poor and better learning goals. And it can be viewed, if you're curious, at www.designlearning.org/resource-downloads/helpful-handouts/. All right, we will explore the remainder of the chapter next week.